Listeners, I'm going to be honest. I've struggled to write an intro to this episode. So instead of writing anything else, I will simply say bone, 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 bone. Tell me what you're going to do, ladies and gentlemen. Well, I'll tell you what we're going to do here today on the Fairly KickAss podcast, a deep dive into the progenitors of the Cleveland sound of hip hop. Anthony Henderson, Charles Scruggs Jr., Brian Anthony McCain II, and Stephen and Stanley House are not household names. And there's no reason that they should be, because those are their human names. They are better known in the limelight as, respectively, Crazy Bone, Wishbone, Busy Bone, Lazy Bone, and Flesh and Bone, collectively Bone Thugs and Harmony. With me today in the Fairly KickAss virtual studio are my brothers in the trenches, Soup Bone and Wanna Bone. And I'm your guide into the thuggish, ruggish circus, Flustered Bone.
Yes, to answer your question, yes.
Do you guys have any opening remarks before I launch into this sometimes uncomfortable tale?
Well, certainly not after that, no.
Yeah, I mean, there's no encore here. Oh my! I'm not
even sure which one of you I wanted to be which. I just came up with.
Yeah, I wasn't going to ask. I didn't want to know. I didn't need reasons. I just.
Oh no, it'll come back later and we'll make use of it.
Indeed, as we should.
Yeah. Okay, so Dan, Wannabone, you had mentioned to me something about the persistent darkness in Bone Thugs and Harmony's music. We were talking about that the other day. Go ahead.
No, I was waiting for something to go on from that.
Yeah, well,
statement. I was. Yes, I was.
You took a breath. I thought you were going to talk. So what about that darkness? Did you find that like to be distracting, or was that something that you thought was really like something appealing in their music?
No, I mean, it was just the style, because you had, it was the juxtaposition of styles, actually, because you had these lush harmonic vocals, and then, just even in the heavy gangsta era, these dark themes, darker beats that kind of fit a West Coast sound. So you could tell they're working with some West Coast producers, but not quite completely. Like there was enough variance, I guess, what eventually became a Midwest sound, which, by the way, if you try to like segment that off, there's really nothing unifying besides geographic locations in that one.
Yeah.
I don't think so, at least.
Yeah. And darkness is actually, darkness is something that I found like over present. Go ahead, Zach.
No, I'm sorry. I was just saying, just kind of piggybacking on what Dan said. Like, yeah, you had pockets of different areas in the Midwest that had their own style. You had Chicago, obviously, was very distinct. Detroit was very distinct. Even Pittsburgh, had a very distinct sound to it. St. Louis, we don't have to talk about because Nelly's fucking trash. But the other regions are very important in the tapestry of hip hop music.
Yeah. And I think Bone is probably unique in that vein of dark material. There's not a lot of that in this area of hip hop. That's more of a West Coast thing, where the beats are down and all that. And I would say that that's definitely, it's an unflappable thing in their music, is that darkness. And there may be good reason for that. While their backgrounds kind of vary, there's a common thread in the backgrounds of all five members of this, and that is not good. There's a lot of darkness in their background. Case in point, so Busy, like I found when he was 4, he and his sisters were abducted from their home while their mom was at work. They were held captive for over 2 years. Most of that, like, they were driven around a lot of places, but they were held mostly on like the Kaw Indian Reservation in Oklahoma. What happened was the babysitter at the time, they were abducted, and then they had a babysitter, and their babysitter saw a photo on a made for TV movie about the abduction of John Walsh's son, John Walsh being the producer of America's Most Wanted. So there was a story about his son's abduction, and she saw Busy's picture at the end of that film, called the police, and that led to Busy and his sisters being reunited with their family.
Holy shit. And just for the listener's sake, to make sure they caught the period of time, you said 2 years.
2 years
that they were held captive.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, and there's other stuff like
you don't expect that story in in anyone's like just personal bio.
And then stuff like so Lazy and Flesh, they don't talk much about their story, but during a hearing for Flesh after he was arrested for pulling an AK on a dude, the presiding Van Nuys Superior Court judge deemed his story. He said the house's life story is one of the worst cases of child abuse she had ever read, full of beatings and other physical, emotional, and mental traumas. I don't have details on that. That's just what the court justice said, court judge.
Which might be for the best, it sounds like.
Right. And Crazy is a 4th generation Jehovah's Witness. No comment.
You just dropped that there.
I did.
In the midst of everything.
Yeah.
Well played.
We're gonna get calls about that one.
Yeah, we're losing at least one listener for sure.
So that's like the darkness of the past, and the musical part of this story begins in Cleveland in 7th grade. Lazy and Wish are cousins, and they hook up with Busy and Crazy, whose previous relationship is not part of any documentation I could find. But they started writing stuff together under the name Band-Aid Boys, which I think we can all agree is a very middle school name.
Yeah, so that's the type of band name you come up with in 7th grade.
Yes.
Yeah, it does sound like a bit of a ripoff, though.
God damn it.
I can't.
I love the fact, not that happened, because around here I expect that kind of thing, but you are just so proud to have that one hit like it did too. That was even better.
My whole life building up to this moment.
Oh man. Wow.
KO.
So when I can't even. All right. All right. When they're asked about that time in their musical history, they usually answer with something like, and I'll quote this, it says, "Our style just came from us sitting in our house with nothing to eat, just tripping and writing and just building on it. And we finally came up with what we got." That's from Crazy. He adds, "We knew we had something different. Our music is just coming from the heart. We always knew we were going to make it somehow." I don't really know what to do with that quote other than that, seemed to work out for him.
I'd say so.
Yeah. So they changed their name when they kind of got their sound together. They changed their name to Bone Enterprise. And as Bone Enterprise, stylized with the characteristic acronym looking BONE and a $ for an S, and Enterprise, they recorded a record called Faces of Death. There's some controversy here because it was kind of released without their consent. And it's a weird story, and I'm not sure I understand it. But the record is on Spotify, so I listened to it. And it is important because it's how they got their start. And I don't expect you guys to have dug this deep, but did you get the chance to check out this record?
I did. Yeah. I couldn't find it on Spotify. I did find it on YouTube where I was able to listen to the whole thing. And it just, I guess the best way to put it and how I have it in my notes is raw. It's, a very raw album. Of course it is. I mean, it's their first album, right? You can hear kind of the beginnings of that signature sounds, some of the beginnings of the harmonies, the swang, if you will, but it's just so very rudimentary. It's so brass tacks.
Yeah. Dan, how about you? No. Okay. Well, it kind of reminded me of like Fushnikins and Tag Team. Like there was high energy. There was a lot of skill, but absolutely stupid lyrics like "pass the pussy on the left-hand side."
Was that in Def Dick by any chance?
I believe so. Yeah.
That lyric?
It's the real reggae. Yeah.
Yeah. That
Just
song was awful.
stupid.
That was by far my least favorite song of the album. Not partially because, as we listen to more and more as we go along with this, you'll notice that one of the typical tropes of rap music is women. And that really is largely absent from most of Bone's catalog. So to hear a song that is basically about women in, that sort of more, I guess, degrading way, for lack of a better term, not only is it not a good song, but it also is not representative of what Bone ended up being as time went on. So it was kind of a juxtaposition, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, and it comes up it's usually like when it comes up in their music later, it's usually like one line at a time. Like you'll hear it like
not a whole song.
Grab the cash, gonna mash the gash. Right. Like it shows up periodically, but not in full force like on that track.
Exactly.
But you know what? Those kinds of things, it makes sense that like Eazy-E would be the guy to pick them up based on that kind of work.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so.
Yeah. And, good reason. The guys, at this point, they shortened their name to simply Bone, and they fell in love with Eazy-E. The love was probably already there. They probably already loved him, but this is where it really comes into play. And they decided that they were going to have like a one-track mind with like Destination Ruthless as the goal. Eazy's co-founder, Eazy-E was the founder of Ruthless Records. He founded it with a man named Jerry Heller. Jerry Heller happened to be from Shaker Heights, which is Cleveland.
Shaker Heights.
Yeah.
Represent.
And so there was probably some affection, like for like Bone wanted that. They held affection for Ruthless because of that. And I'm sure that Jerry Heller had some input into them being signed. But what happened was Flesh had saved up a handful of paychecks from KFC. So he was the oldest and I believe the only one with a job. He bought 5 tickets to LA, and the plan was to track down Eazy and perform for him. This did not
Which
work out.
Sounds like a movie script, doesn't it?
It
Right?
does. It does. And it didn't work out as planned. So it was supposed to be a 3-day trip. They were supposed to go, perform, and return. And it turned into several weeks of them like performing on the streets and staying in flop houses and trap houses. And they just kept calling on Ruthless and got no response. They kept getting nothing, leaving voicemails, showing up at the door, not getting any meetings. Again, still sounds like a movie.
Right. It's like Spring Breakers Redux.
Yeah. And there's some.
I have no idea what the.
I was gonna say, like, what?
The
guy who's never seen movies, like in general, references of all flicks.
It's like they're not going to notice this. Right? I couldn't go through with it though. I wouldn't have felt good about it.
It's fine. So there are some conflicting stories about what happened next. One story says that they learned that Eazy was performing in Cleveland, so they like bummed enough money, or as Wish put it, like slang and rap door to door like drugs. And they, that's what he said.
Can we dive into this just real quickly? Like,
sure, go for it.
Like, is this like the encyclopedia salesmen or like the door to door vacuum guys, but they just like knock on your door and fucking rap at you, and then they like get money?
He literally, I don't know. He literally said slang and rap door to door.
That is the best job I've ever heard in my entire life.
Like Christmas carolers with a mission.
Door rap sales. Oh, that's so good.
Then so they found out that they got enough money doing that to like hightail it back to Cleveland and like catch Eazy at the show. The other version that I found is that Eazy like got a hold of Crazy's verse from Flow Motion, and then he received a verse from Busy over the phone, and then he requested a formal audition after one of his performances in Cleveland. So I guess you can decide which version makes the most sense to you. Either way, he signed them nearly on the spot, and he's the one that added the Thugs and Harmony to their name. That was all Eazy, which, good call, right?
Yes.
And then he started producing their debut EP, Creeping on a Come Up. The debut single from this is, you guys remember?
The debut single.
Yeah.
Thuggish Ruggish Bone.
Was it Thuggish Ruggish Bone? Was that the debut?
It was the first one. Thuggish Ruggish Bone.
So they hit quick and they hit hard then.
Quick and hard. It hit.
That's a hard track.
It was, and it hit hard. It hit number 22 on the Hot 100, number 2 on the hip hop charts, and it gave them everything they needed right there out of the gate. Lots of clout immediately. The release also had For the Love of Money, which featured Mr. Eric Wright himself. The album would eventually be certified 4 times platinum, selling in excess of 4 million copies, and is an iconic joint, right? What do you guys, do you have like a favorite track from this record?
Yeah, I mean, sorry. I was trying not to hog the line for once. I feel like I always hog the line. It's hard to say that Thuggish Ruggish Bone isn't the best track on this album. It's obviously the most popular track on the album, one of the most popular tracks in their entire catalog. But I am going to go a slightly different direction and say that No Surrender is actually a slightly better track. It hits harder. It is just a super super rough track, even more so than Thuggish Bone. I feel like that quintessential kind of melodic Bone pre-hook. This was kind of everyone's first introduction really to Bone. So, to hear that Mikilla, Minno Surrender, that just very sing-songy style that everyone was like, the first time you heard it, you're like, what the heck is this? And then you started listening, it's like, I don't care what this is, it just sounds good.
Yeah. How about you, Dan?
Well, actually, as this would be kind of boring, my standout track was actually For the Love of Money, because first and foremost, that easy verse, but also a track that just like seamlessly flows. Like everyone brings their own level of fire. Everyone gets to show off at their best. It just kind of flows right into from one to the next, and then like, God, that backbeat's just hypnotic. I think that's the best record of the track. But then, then I picked the deep cut, which was No Surrender. Yeah. Because it was so much different than the rest of the album, but still that rapid fire bursts, and let's be honest, a bass line that just you have to blast loud.
Just it's like a slug to the chest.
Yeah,
which is a different artist, but
is a different, and that's a different record.
Yeah, and I think No Surrender is probably my favorite track on the disc. It's just, I love everything, but that's probably my favorite. The siren that like opens, that's just cool.
Yeah. Now, I won't go so far as to say that everything on this album is good.
Well,
because Mr. Ouija is a trash track, and it has no place on Creeping on a Come Up.
And yet comes back multiple times throughout their career.
Oh my gosh, we don't have to cover it at least for like 6 more albums, thankfully. So. Or like, one more album.
One more album. It's on the next one. So at this point, how would you describe the style? Like, Dan, you mentioned earlier that it's kind of West Coast, but is it like gangster rap? Is it just West Coast hip hop? Is it like, what is it truly a Midwest style at this point?
No, it's a Bone Thug style. Like it is its own. And we talked a little bit about this as we continue to go forward. You'll see as they get older in their career, they do tend to they seem to try to adapt to the sound of the era, but always spin their own touch on it. I mean, there is no question whether you put a Bone record from 1995 or 2015, you know that it is Bone.
Yeah.
It may sound like Flo Rida in the back and Bone Thugs in the front, but it's unquestionably Bone.
What kind of mullet is that? I'm not even sure what to call that.
One that doesn't ever need to be replayed.
Such a good line.
Yeah, I like it. All right. So they have a weird relationship at this point, especially Flesh and Bone has a weird relationship with everything. He's the only one of the 5 of them that did not sign to Ruthless. And most of that was because in many interviews with the members of the outfit, he was smoking sherm, which is, tobacco mixed with weed and then dipped in PCP. I had to look that up.
I don't know, actually.
No, I had to look it up myself.
Okay.
Yeah, smoking sherm.
That explains Sherman Helmsley. Got it.
Sherman Helmsley. It's true.
Yeah, it's
Larry.
Yeah, so it's tobacco mixed with weed and then dipped in PCP, and then he, getting in fights with cops, and he was a real mess at this point. And the other members of the band thought so as well. So they went and signed their contracts without him. And then, according to Eazy's communications with Flesh, and then Flesh telling other people about it, they didn't want to pay him for the work on the record because he was on the recording on Creeping on a Come Up, but they didn't want to pay him for it. And he wound up suing the rest of the outfit for his cut of Creeping on a Come Up. And that meant he was suing his brother, their cousin, and the record label, like everybody involved. And that sort of explains why there's only 4 of them in most of the photos that led up to their first full length.
Now, how fucked up must you feel if you're Flesh and Bone and you're like kind of in this band that's becoming like super like meteorically popular, but no one even like mentions your existence. You're not really on any sort of promotional items. You're not getting paid a dime, and you're barely even rapping at all up until the 4th album, I believe.
Yeah. Well, and he's the one that paid for them to be able to go out and do this in the first place.
Exactly. Like that's a really fucked up kind of how do you do, you know?
Right. But it all worked out sort of at this point, except for Flesh. Easy was pushing them forward. Their relationship with Easy sort of ended, obviously, abruptly when Easy died from AIDS-related pneumonia in 1995, just shortly before the release of East 1999 Eternal, their first full-length record for Ruthless Records. His death sort of was the catalyst that prompted the redux of Tha Crossroads. And now, actually, the original album version of that song is only available on YouTube, and at least as far as I've been able to find. So I think we should post the link to that YouTube video somewhere on here, because as far as I'm concerned, it's the better song of the two.
Right. And certainly, I don't think it was the remix was what was the most popular version.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah. The remix is the one that had the video for. So what happened was they had recorded the album before Easy died. And then the album was released, and then they did the video, but the video version of the song is not anything close to what was on the album. So in re-releases of the album only have the MTV version of the song, the tribute to Eazy-E. And while it's, that's everybody, boom, 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 boom. Everybody knows the song. But it is, in my opinion, a weaker track to the one that originally featured on the record. How about the rest of the record? What on Eternal sticks with you guys?
I mean, for my money, exactly what you just said. Eternal. To me, that is the part of it is that I feel like it's just a really strong track. I can't say definitively that it's the best track on this album just because there's so many good tracks on this album. Mr. Bill Collector, obviously first of the month, another big single, but Eternal was just near and dear to me because it had a video game tie-in, and as a young child growing up in Northern Ohio during that period of time and loving Bone Thugs and Harmony, and also loving the video game that this was sampled by, which was the Sega Genesis fighting game Eternal Champions, and not realizing until much, much later in life that that is the genesis, pun intended, of that sample. Like, it was just like, holy shit, I love this game and Bone like 20 times more now that I know that.
Yeah.
For folks who want to check that out on YouTube, just search for Eternal Champions character bios music, and you will be able to hear the original sample. You'll immediately recognize it if you've heard the track. It's pretty cool.
Awesome.
You mentioned what I figured was the standout track, and it's not The Crossroad. It is First of the Month. In a continuing theme of everything that I have done since the beginning of this blog, it's the juxtaposition of a song, of a light, airy sounding backtrack, and then a grim as hell set of lyrics. And that's exactly what this thing is. And it's something that they end up doing very well throughout their entire career. Find a jam that's pleasant, and it's got pleasant elements, and then backhand it with harsh realities and violent outbursts. And as you mentioned, my pick for a deep cut off this record was definitely Mr. Bill Collector.
Yeah, I dig that. I'm also a big fan of Mo Murda, but that's probably my favorite track on the disc. But I don't know. I love the whole thing. It's really like, to me, that album doesn't have a weak track on it. I think the whole thing,
exactly,
start to finish, is just awesome.
That's why it's so hard to pick one, right? It's like, but this track is good too, and that other track is great.
Yeah. This record actually, to me, represents like the pinnacle of their career, right? They did other stuff after this. They did a lot of stuff, like a whole lot of stuff since this record came out in 95. But this represents to me the best that they sounded and the best that they worked together. And then they followed it up with a two-parter. I don't know if you call it a double album or just a two. I don't even know. Was it released at the same time? Does anybody know?
I think so. Yeah. I think it was a legit double album, I believe.
Yeah. And it took the sound that they perfected on East 1999 Eternal, and then it took that sound and production that's now iconic, and they just pushed it forward. They kept the content pretty well focused on street life and weed, hate for the cops, and everything that comes with that. But occasionally on this record, it's actually dolloped with an element of hope for the future. For example, on like If I Could Teach the World, they beg for no Mo Murda. in direct contrast to their song Mo Murda. I don't really have much to say about the Art of War Art of War World War I and II, aside from the fact that if you speed up a 33 RPM to 45 RPM, Crazy sounds like Tupac. Sorry, other way around. If it was, he sounds like Tupac on 45 RPM. Let's put it that way.
Now, I have a record player, but I don't have any idea what anything that you just said means. So I still have a lot to learn. I still have a lot to learn.
You're a bad hipster.
A terrible hipster. I don't even have like the dark glasses.
No, here you.
Yeah, nice. I'm in.
You
So the one thing overall that I took from this album, besides what Jeremy had mentioned, was that there was a lot of, I don't even know how to put it, revenge rap, I guess, like almost diss tracks in a lot of ways, like legit diss tracks. Like it was almost like we've got something to prove, everyone's hating on us, and we have to speak out against it. And we've obviously heard many great diss tracks. Obviously some of the standouts being like Nas's Ether, Jay-Z's The Takeover being two of the the best instances of that. But these aren't that. These are very far from that. And I feel like it does soil what is otherwise a pretty solid double album, which could probably be a single album and have half of the tracks just kind of thrown away.
That is exactly the point that I would make to this track, is that if there's one thing that I would think about this with a lot of this stuff, it's filler. You could have made this one disc and it would have been an all-time classic, and it was stretched out to, and it's actually probably Tupac's fault.
It's always Tupac's fault.
Well, the year before, when he brought out the double album and it was such a success, then all of a sudden all of hip-hop decided we need to do a double album too. And the problem with a double album is you have to have 2 albums of material, not a desire to have 2 albums of worth of material. So a lot of the stuff, that's the problem. A lot of those tracks that came off as diss tracks were filler. They weren't great. And they felt like they were trying to, it was an attempt to clap back at those that said they couldn't follow up a smash like East 99 by proving them right, that they didn't have the content to follow up that record. If you would have just condensed it down and made it one, a whole different story.
Yeah, and you brought up Tupac, or I brought him up and you talked about him, but like his track on the record is pretty great. The track they did with him on there, which is Thug Love, right? I said that right.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an interesting thought because they're only like 3 albums, 3 and 4, depending on how you want to label this one, albums into their career. And it's the second time that they were scheduled to do like a full length record alongside a prominent star. Like they were supposed to do a full length record with Eazy-E and he died. And then Tupac, they were supposed to do a full length record with him. And then he was tragically cut short as well. And both of them they were scheduled to do a whole album, and then both of them did exactly one song with them before passing.
And according to Wikipedia on that, since we're talking about Thug Love, apparently Busy Bone at one point confirmed that Tupac wrote his entire verse in 1 minute and 51 seconds.
Sounds right.
Which I don't know if I believe, because that doesn't sound possible. Even for someone as great as Tupac was, that's like less than 2 minutes.
Like, and not that he couldn't come up with the idea that quickly, but I don't know if you could physically write down that verse in under 2 minutes and actually have all those words out on a piece of paper that quickly.
Right, like, is he a stenographer or something? Like, does he have shorthand jumping off?
I mean, maybe he could have typed it out.
Yeah, that wouldn't have surprised me if like he just had somebody with him all the time, like writing everything down that he said.
The second best job next to door-to-door rap salesman would be Tupac's lyric writer. Yes.
You wrote his albums? Well, I wrote down his albums. He did the actual lyric stuff. I just put what he said on paper.
All right. So then at this point in their career, go ahead.
No, I was just talking about the actual tracks before we moved on to.
Oh, go ahead. Do it.
The Resurrection, if you had them. Because, I mean, I stand out. You mentioned If I Could Teach the World. It's one of the more introspective tracks of the record. It's got the feeling of a song that wants you to sit down, spark a bowl, and think about your damn life. It's also unique at some of his very best behind the board.
And that touches on a great point that I don't think Unique got nearly enough credit for what he brought to Bone. Nearly enough.
Agreed.
I mean, especially part of the, as we get into the 2000s, and your opinions on the 2000s Bone may vary, but the thing you can constantly pick up is the evolution of DJ Unique as a producer. And you can also tell when they started to drift away from him, and he was working on fewer and fewer tracks on an album.
Yeah. It was his absence was definitely notable on some tracks.
Yes. Also, shout out to Doug Love. Like I said, that was my deep cut. And I know it's hard to call any track with Tupac as a feature a deep cut, but man, like, is there a better, like, if you're going to make a double album, that's the way to kick off disc 2 with the completely different energy that Tupac will bring. And like just kind of force the song in completely different directions as a piece than the rest of the album.
I actually like my deep cut from that record would probably be Body Rot.
That's also a good one,
which is actually still like that still has things that would resonate now.
Yeah.
As like 1990s, like this ain't gonna stop until the motherfucking cops body rot. Right? Like there's a lot going on now that it's where it still resonates.
It's a super real track.
Yeah.
My deep cut was It's All Real, which was admittedly more R&B than rap and kind of showed some of the beginnings of Bone's somewhat evolution, as we'll see in later albums, into not an R&B group, but a group with a lot of R&B aspects to it. And this was one of the first instances of their harmonies kind of having more of that style on display, as opposed to like the harder backbeat. So it was a good track, and it was a cool track to see. Like Dan mentioned, the evolution. This was, in my eyes, one of the beginnings of that piece of their evolution.
Yeah. And okay, speaking of evolution too, like they start doing a lot of different stuff at this point in their career. They start doing a bunch of solo records, for one thing. They do a lot of solo records at this point. They started their own labels between like Crazy Bone started like 2 different labels. And then they had the Mo Thug family thing going on, and it was crazy. Not Crazy Bone, just crazy. And then they were just, being all famous and shit. And then like some rumors started about a split. And some of this was, based on, the lawsuit from Flesh, the fact that they were all doing completely separate things from each other. So those rumors were given a little credence. Wishbone tried to put some of those rumors to bed when he did interviews, and he was saying things like that the intent was always for them to do their own things. And then they tried to make sure that everyone knew that was the case. And they released BTNH Resurrection, actually very prominently featuring Flesh. He's the most prominent,
right?
Yeah, finally. He is the only member. He's the most prominent member of the outfit on this album. And that was probably mostly to help settle those rumors. And it turned out to be almost ironic, because about 6 months after the release of the record, Flesh pled guilty to assault with a firearm and criminal possession of a weapon, and he was sentenced to 11 years in prison.
So for all the fans who were kind of, waiting at the time, like, we know that Flesh is hot. We know that he can rhyme. We know that he's dope. And they finally get what they've been wanting for 6 years by this point, 7 years. And then he goes to prison for a dime. It's like, That's not fair. Nothing about that's fair.
No. And I find this to be one of their weakest releases in the catalog. Busy is actually the only member of the group to appear on every track. Crazy is only on a little over half of them. And I feel like that really shows. Like that's pretty indicative of all of their stuff from this point forward. Like the records that like Crazy has a lot to do with, and that Lazy have a lot to do with, they do really well. And then the ones where like maybe Busy and Flesh are the most featured members, they're not as fun to listen to. What do you guys think?
I mean, to me, like it was very, I don't want to say plain, but I thought of it as like kind of like Art of War, but just not like the good tracks weren't as good and the bad tracks weren't as bad. It was just kind of like a very middle of the road, like a group that really needed to put out a release and get some cash, but they didn't really have the same fire that they did, 5 or 6 years ago. I think that piece is evident, like you said, Jeremy, the fact that, you have whole tracks where, different members are just not featured at all, when that's never been a part of, Bone's kind of DNA. They've always been, for the most part, they've been on every single track together. So just to have whole tracks that are missing Busy or missing Crazy, it's just like, it's very evident that that's not there, and it's just not very sonically pleasing, I guess, compared to what we would expect from them at that point.
But I will say this, that all the production feels a lot more polished.
I can't argue that.
There doesn't seem unlike and the opposite, unlike Art of War, it doesn't really feel like any of the tracks are filler. They all seem to fit together as a complete piece, but they're all very meh.
Yeah, I mean, and that's fair. That it does feel more cohesive than Art of War did. That's true.
Yeah.
But there's a problem when arguably the best track on your record is literally your biggest single, just with better production and fuck the haters lyrics. Because it's my standout, Resurrection, possibly the best track of the record. It's The Crossroads.
Paper.
It's The Crossroads. It's the same flow. They got the same inflection, same rhythm breakdowns. In this case, I think it works, but that's probably going to wear out quickly, I'd imagine. But also,
you reckon we might be hearing more of these Crossroads like tracks?
I'm thinking they're. I mean, it's possible. We seem to be trending in that direction. Also, sidebar: don't sleep on Change the World.
Yeah, Change the World, super dope.
Gives me the same vibes that Tupac's Changes does, and not just because of the similar name.
Right on. I actually also really dug Weed Song.
Yeah, I would say that's my deep cut. That's my deep cut. Let me put this: is there a better homage to the herb? Is it Because I Got High? Fuck that noise. This is a true love song to the high.
Because foreshadowing's awesome. Like, there is a better homage to the herb, and it's coming up soon.
It's coming up.
Yeah, okay. You could tell how I wrote things as they naturally progressed when I started at the beginning and at the end. But I would say this about that: if you threw some more horns in the background, that Weed Song is a neo soul track.
I would agree with that 1,000%.
Yeah,
super dope.
Absolutely. Cool.
One that jumped out for me as a deep track or as a deep cut was The Righteous Ones. Super solid hook. One of the few tracks on the album that really showcased each member kind of individually, and they all sounded really, almost like old school Bone. That's a mouthful for me to say. And my favorite part was that Flesh's lyrics for me were the actual best part of the song. So not only is he here, but he's here and prominent and really, really good. I mean, he is as advertised until he goes to prison. That minor detail.
So we keep going.
Just minor.
And then he went to jail.
I mean,
dot.
Stick an AK in someone's face. That'll do it.
Yeah, it was one of his friends too.
There. Not anymore.
yeah, not anymore. So Flesh.
Who hasn't threatened their friend with a gun right to the face? I mean, seriously. There was a time back in high school where Zach and I would assault each other like every other day. It's not even a thing.
Just about to say it. Desert Eags in our lockers,
Right? I mean, if I could count the number of times this man pistol whipped me, and yet we're still so close.
It brought us together.
Right.
It was a bonding exercise.
It was the collective concussions that made the friendship so tight.
Which is more true than the listeners.
Yeah, it's actually
for reasons that we won't get into in this podcast.
I was just telling one of those stories earlier today, actually.
Oh, there's a video somewhere, I'm sure.
No, there's not.
Thank God.
Yeah, thank God social media wasn't around when we were in high school.
Seriously.
Ooh, that would have been bad for us. Yo, and hello, Ass Kicker or Ass Kickers, if you're listening in a group. However many of you there are, you all just listened to part 1 of the once vaulted, fairly kick-ass deep dive into Lazy, Crazy, Busy, Wish, and Flesh N, making up Cleveland's own Bone Thugs and Harmony. It was a tad too long for one episode, so we split it into 2. But the second part is just as good as the first, so stay tuned next Wednesday for that. As always, you can find the Fairly Kick-Ass podcast wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on the various socials. Same name throughout, at Fairly Kick-Ass on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Threads. Make sure to check out our website, fairlykickass.com, for ride-along playlists for this episode and every episode of the podcast, and some other fun things as well. Hit us up with any emails you might have at fairlykickass@gmail.com. And above all else, always remember to keep kicking ass.